One day the world changed dramatically from the opened gates. Terrible and terrifying monsters began to crawl out, reaching out with their hands from the abyss in the ground. But there were also those people who were able to obtain certain powers and become stronger than an ordinary person. These people had abilities. They began to be called hunters. They rushed into battle with those individuals that emerged from the depths of the earth. People stood waiting for the hunters, whispering, because not everyone managed to get through the dungeon and return. Finally, the black-haired man pointed his finger at the open portal and shouted that someone was coming out. Everyone stared there. First, a sharp blade appeared, then a foot in a white sneaker, and only then did the body begin to appear. The people were rejoicing, and the gates were already closing. But the one who came out from there was hunched over, as if the weight of the years he had lived was pressing down on him. Hunter Jean announced that the dungeon was protected, and there were no more monsters there. He was famous for being able to clear a dungeon that was difficult to enter at the age of 60. One day this man disappeared, simply evaporated like air. But 10 years later he reappeared. The nurse in the blue uniform put his hands on his hips and laughed at this statement that he was a great hunter. The man walked up to the other guy and exhaled in frustration. It started again, and the old man sat on the bed and waved his hands furiously. The guys turned to him, and he repeated the same thing over and over again, that he was Jean, a great hunter. The young men decided that it was just a joke, laughed, and considered this man a swindler who had deceived people in the past. Laughing, they wanted to finish quickly and go home. But suddenly the guy with glasses grabbed their hand and looked away. Suddenly the guy ran up frightened, asking what had happened to the man, who was crouching on his feet. There was a deafening scream and the man turned around and saw a huge cockroach behind him. The red-haired man was held by the neck by a claw, trying to pry it away with both hands, begging to be saved. The boy's wide-open eyes stared without looking away. Drops of blood splashed onto his face. The young man's mouth opened in a silent scream when he saw that his comrade's head was already lying nearby. He huddled against the wall in fear, waving his hands and screaming for them not to touch him, fear and panic all mixed up. Salvation came from where no one expected it. The old man jumped on the cockroach and cut it across with a knife. The nurse, who was stunned by this turn of events, painted his body red with blood. Jean looked at the boy and said that they needed to run immediately and not sit and waste time. Grandpa straightened up, looked to the side, gave orders to the young man as if he always did so, and most importantly, they listened to him. Jean looked back at the guy who was worried and asked him what he would do on his own. He turned away from him, closed his eyes and snapped, "He will do what he always did, what he must do." Stepping over the dead cockroach, the man moved on. The discouraged young man remained standing and was speechless. Only now I realized that all this was true. All the stories that my grandfather told before were true, and he really was the hunter Jean. More and more huge, terrible insects emerged from the portal, rushing to attack. Looking at these monsters, he didn't understand what the association that was supposed to protect people was doing. Suddenly the insects saw the man who was watching them. They raised their antennae upward, and a disgusting sound came out of their throats. Jean straightened up. He saw that they had noticed him, which meant it was time for a warm-up. He furiously rushed into the attack, stabbing the first monster in the head, twisting a hole in it. He squinted and noticed that the second one was also attacking him with its mouth open. He jumped on him and actively chopped down the monsters, doing so deftly and cheerfully despite his age. He shouted angrily, "You need to kill everyone so that everyone gets what they deserve. You have to defend your place." The man's knife began to glow in his hands, and thanks to this power, he began to chop up the monsters more and more actively. After defeating everyone, the man stood up, raised his head, and looked into the distance. Something was approaching. Jean came to the disappointing conclusion that he had really gotten old. It was already hard to fight with several beetles. He was out of breath. The hero was glued together. He saw in front of him the leader of these beetles, a terrible one, who was looking at him. A huge green grasshopper made piercing sounds and towered over the character. He parried the man's blow. The grasshopper threw him into a stone, hit his back, and the air rushed out of his lungs. The grasshopper stood and watched, making sounds, while the man exhaled and leaned weakly against the stone. The main character pressed his back against the stone and did not raise his eyes. After all, age was taking its toll on him. There was no strength left to do anything. Bringing his mustachioed face closer and closer to him, the man exhaled sharply. Opening one eye, he didn't like the fact that they were poking a dirty snout at him. He dropped his hands, which held the knife, and hit the very face of the monster, who had not even expected such a thing. The grasshopper raised and shook his head, throwing the man into a tree, and he hit his back again, driving the knife harder and harder into the head. While already riding the monster, the man tried with all his might to correct the situation. The hero's face was all covered in blood, He opened one eye and exhaled, finishing. Suddenly, strength came from somewhere. My eyes sparkled blue. I decided to finish this now. Jean dealt the fatal blow. Behind him, the grasshopper writhed in agony behind the guy, throwing its muzzle up. Finally, the grasshopper fell down dead with a split head, and the man was sitting on his knees. He smiled, turned his head and looked at the monster. The great hunter was still alive. The man immediately fell to the ground with his hands stretched out in front of him. He no longer had any strength. He tried to raise his head, but his decrepit body no longer obeyed, and then he realized that this was his end. The portal opened, and the man prayed that if he were younger, he could handle everyone, adding sadly that he couldn't be a good hunter all this time. A speech came from the portal, announcing that the dungeon was protected, and congratulating them on it. The same voice announced that a special reward would be given as a reward, reflecting the subject's desire. The man had never heard anything like this before. People's voices were heard. Everything started spinning, but the grandfather didn't see it. When someone tried to call the man to open his eyes, calling him a patient, he sat up on his couch and heard that he was in the hospital because he had been badly injured during the rampage in the dungeon, and the nurse explained all this to him. When conducting a survey, it was necessary to find out when the character was born. A couple of questions, and an answer was required. The man scratched his ear with his finger and began to get angry. He had already repeated his year of birth several times and stared angrily at the nurse. The young girl cried out in surprise. He couldn't be 83 years old. A smile splashed in his wide-open eyes. He exhaled with displeasure, angrily noted that he had already spoken and more than once narrowed his eyes, had poor hearing, apparently, and came to a conclusion. He chuckled, tucked his chin in his hand, showed off. He looks much younger. The girl sweated. Beads of sweat trickled down her cheeks. When Jean looked at the glass, he saw his younger self, which discouraged him, and he stared at his new self. He jumped up to the glass and started touching himself, not understanding what had happened to him. The young nurse looked at him and did not understand what was wrong with him. She decided that it was all because he hit his head hard, and while Jean was examining himself and touching his face with his hand, the girl smiled and decided that she needed to go and see a doctor. The man at this time darkened. He remembered himself dying and the gift that the dungeon presented. The realization clouded him, which meant that it was not a hallucination, it was not expected, it was real. He propped his chin up with his hand and chuckled. So that was what the dungeon's reward turned out to be. Surprisingly, it was the first time he'd heard of anything like it. I froze, looking at my reflection. It was a bit surprising. This had never happened before. They always brought me some other gifts. When the girl returned from the doctor, she opened her mouth in amazement and pulled back the curtain. The hospital bed was free. The man was not in the room. Sweat started running down her face again. The girl did not understand where he had gone. Jean was on the street, looked around and whistled at the large building, came to a place where he had not been for 10 years. He folded his arms across his chest. It was a long time ago when he was last here, when he came to the association. Entering, he scratched his head with his hand. It was not at all the same as before. As he remembered, people were flickering in front of him. Lost and not knowing what to do, he asked the man who looked back at him over his shoulder. But in the end, he still helped, gave advice, pointed with his finger that if he wanted to go in, he needed to get a ticket at the kiosk, where the people were standing. Approaching the kiosk, he was confused and did not know what to do. He scratched his head with his hand again. The crowd behind him began to speak indignantly. The man, who was in a hurry, asked to move out of his way, explaining that he had a lot to do. Jean returned to him and looked at the fist he was clenching in his hand. The man exhaled with displeasure. His whole posture was tense. The young man didn't lose his composure, turned around and pointed his finger at him, and began to scold him that he needed to go back to the line and wait. But the man got angry. He grabbed him by the chest with his hand and brought his angry face closer to him. Suddenly they were interrupted by a huge man who appeared and thundered loudly for them to stop. The one who was indignant turned to him. Beads of sweat rolled down his face, and in front of him stood Paul, who held a high rank. Paul was a red-haired man with sharp eyes and equally sharp features. He was 2 heads taller than the men present. Admiring whispers were heard from the people. They turned to the hands that were hard as a rock. The one who was indignant and whispered an apology was embarrassed. He grinned and closed his eyes with pleasure. Paul really liked it when people said about him that he was a man of men. Jean whispered thoughtfully, looked at the man, who looked familiar to him, and squinted his eyes in anticipation of what would happen next. Again his gaze is directed at the guy. He exhaled with displeasure. There are a lot of thoughts in his head. Suddenly Jean screamed, pointed his finger, made the big guy sweat, open his mouth and widen his eyes from the nickname that came from the boy's lips. People around began to whisper, repeating this nickname. and Paul became confused and his face darkened. The young man came closer, spread his arms, a smile appeared on his face, and began to say that when they last saw him, he looked much fresher. Paul's gaze changed, his eyes darkened, his teeth gnashed. He began to shake all over, unhappy that his old name had been remembered. The high-ranking hunter, who was embarrassed by his cute name, changed it to a more manly name 10 years ago. It was a secret. Bowed his head, and did not understand where the person standing in front of him got this information from. The boy continued to smile, spreading his arms, wanted to ask him about something and did not notice his anger at all. He grabbed the boy by the collar again, shouted at him to stop, became confused, and looked at him with wide eyes. He brought his face, red with anger, closer to him and hissed like a snake, asking who he was and how dare he call him that. The boy didn't fall for it, wasn't afraid of his anger, smiled and gently noted that he had become ruder. Still in his arms, Jean continued to smile, not at all offended by the man's tone. He suddenly unclenched his fingers and let go of the collar of his shirt. He got carried away, he confessed, stepping back. Paul headed for the exit, commanding the boy to follow him, and that they should go to another place. But then he turned around and looked at him angrily. His red face continued to glow. There was no point in running away. He would find him. The main character rolled his eyes and exhaled. This guy amuses him, but still hurried after him. They went out into a large gymnasium, where they stood opposite each other like two rivals. The character thought, looked up, did not understand when such objects began to appear in the association, and what kind of place it was that brought him to. His eyes darkened. He looked straight at her and seriously stated that this was a place where they could fight each other. But the most important thing was that he was interested in how he knew his real name. He noted with displeasure, exhaling that he, Jean, is a great hunter, and some circumstances arose for him, which is why he now looks like this. He turned his displeased face again to the man, saying that he wanted to resolve everything peacefully. The red face from anger and tension turned again to the guy, clenched teeth so that you could hear the creak. He could not control himself. He raised his hand and flew at the main character. Now a few blows, and he will say everything at once. The young boy dodged, surprising Paul, and calmly began to explain that when a person grows up, he becomes calmer. Paul announced that the game was over and began to transform into a huge werewolf beast. Towering, he stood over the character, now promising that he would treat him seriously, clenching his hands into fists. Now in the form of a beast, his eyes flashing yellow, he ran towards the young man, attacking with his paws. Jean flew back from the strong blow. The pebbles of the floor scattered to the sides. The blow was strong. But the character stood firm and did not fall, covering himself with his hand from dust and debris, surprising with such resilience. The monster warned that it would be very painful. His face looked much friendlier than the stone face. The gym was filled with dust from another blow from Paul in the form of an animal, hunched over and looking at where the boy had flown off to. He looked at me with confusion. He had put too much effort into his blow. He didn't see that boy. But he showed himself to be a hero and pounced, clenching his hands into fists, fighting back and flying at the werewolf. It was so stupid. He froze, clenching his powerful jaw, although he was a supreme hunter. But the blow did not cause harm to this man. Jean's face turned black. He returned his own words. A mad smile appeared on his lips. The blow was delivered and even the light began to emanate from the force. The hero swung with one hand and stopped. Our character's blow was much stronger. A dent formed on the floor of the hall, and the beast flew away into the distance. It was all over. Jean stood there defeated, and Paul was lying on his back. There was only one blow, and it was very strong, and it was able to knock down such a big guy. He darkened, raised his hand to his head, hoping that the man had not died, that he had overdone it. The boy looked up from under his brow, long blonde hair framing his disgruntled face. It was Paul Dublin, 25 years old. Jean, who was then of age, drawled out his name. His whitish eyes narrowed and stopped on the boy. The old man sat on the mountain of monsters he had slain, groaning and complaining about the pain in his back. Paul raised his head, beads of sweat running down his face, and breathed out the elder's name. The old man approached the boy, bowing down, and understood that power in its pure form was right there in front of him. Jana's face lit up with a smile. He noted that he needed to train more, and then everything would work out. He extended his hand, pointing at the young man. Now the man leaned over and tried to call Paul. It seemed to him that he was sleeping. He was a little worried about his condition. When he realized that there was a living person in front of him, he smiled and was afraid that he had used too much force. The boy grinned, sat down next to him, exhaled. I didn't teach him to greet people like that. I hadn't seen him for 10 years. The next question from the lying guy made him confused. He thought that he hadn't had enough. His hair even stood on end. As he got up, Jean rubbed his shoulder. A blessing had happened, as he called it, looking at the guy lying below. Paul closed his eyes, lowered his head. Unlike the skill, the ability is constantly activated. He made a verdict. Jean exhaled with displeasure. He realized that the boy in front of him also knew little about this blessing. The man appeared in all his beauty, his bare torso sparkling and shimmering with rough muscles, scratching the back of his head, regretting that he could not help his old friend. Jean's face changed. He saw that he was without clothes. He in turn apologized. The clothes were ruined because of his ability to turn into a beast. He smiled knowingly. He had become younger, for whatever reason, and he couldn't ask for more. Paul opened his arms and shouted that if he had become younger, then he could return to the hunters again, and people would know that the great hunter had returned. The next answer from Jean surprised him, and he couldn't find any words to respond to it. He didn't want people to know that he had returned. Paul's expression was surprised. He stared, waiting for the man's answer, trying to understand the reason for retirement. As soon as the hunter began to list the names of all those who were dear and important to them, Paul's face turned dark. He lowered his head, regretfully repenting that he could not forget them, because they were such dear people. It was a pity, he continued, that they all sacrificed themselves to protect him, and thanks to their lives, he was able to survive in many dungeons. The man screamed, putting his hand to his chest and hitting it hard. He would have done the same to save him, because he is very important to them. He cut it off and said that this was exactly why he retired, and raised his head. Paul looked at him in dismay, beads of sweat rolling down his face. As if plunging into memories, the young man continued that his presence at some point became too important for people. He was tormented by the thought that he had survived only thanks to those people whose deaths were on his hands. Memories took him back to those moments when those same people died, not sparing their lives, just for him, and he was afraid of a repetition. Paul began to understand and promised that if the man really wanted this, he would keep his secret. Unable to resist asking a question, he spread his arms out to the side and asked what he was planning to do now. But Jean was still thinking. He asked the young guy a question again. He stared in surprise and raised his head as soon as he heard about the request. With a slight smile on his lips, Jean looked at his wrist, on which a green bracelet was flaunting, with the help of which ranks were easily recognized. His gaze became serious as the memory brought him back to the moment when they were in the gym together with Paul. Pointing his hand upward, he wanted the boy to join them and explore the easy category dungeon. Paul stared at him. There was an investigation going on, he started telling, and he had a premonition, so now he was turning to him with a request. He scratched the back of his head with his hand. He just wants the elders to ensure him in any case, Jean exhaled in agreement. He will help as much as he can. He was rudely interrupted from his memories by a man with the same green bracelet on his hand, who pushed him in the back, clenched his teeth, and ordered him to move out of the way. The guy raised his head, asked someone to apologize, and as they passed by, the two guys looked at each other and snapped. Then the sycophants of that same man began to say that soon the brother would be promoted to the next rank, and a newcomer like him should not block the path of a promising warrior. The former leader of the Scorpion Gang, and now a hunter, grinned, realized that this was his first raid and asked to leave him, laughing condescendingly. The guys laughed, walked away with their hands in their pockets, laughed at the fact that he was extremely lucky. The guy stood there clutching his hands and did not understand what had happened to them. He shouted that they were rude, thought that some people don't change and continue to judge others by their appearance, and hissed. Suddenly, he was pulled out of his thoughts again. A hand was on the guy's shoulder. The older man narrowed his eyes, assured that they always mock the newbie and should not be taken to heart. He moved away at a distance, introduced himself. His name was Cleo Stern, and addressed the boy as a student. But then Jean extended his hand and introduced himself. The man laughed, and he remembered the great hunter. When the conversation turned to age, the guy exhaled that he was 80 years old, but remained serious, not a hint of a joke. The man froze in confusion with a question, not understanding how he could be 80 years old, scratched his head in confusion, and admitted that he would only be 18 this year. He laughed again, a good joke, put his arm around Cleo's shoulders, and said that he was the same age as his son, and that going down into the dungeon was apparently very profitable. Jean gritted his teeth and grinned, because no one knew. But he had a son. He would be about the same age as the man standing next to him. Suddenly, girls appeared. They stood with bows in their hands and smiled, pleasantly surprised that among these boors there were even cute guys. The red-haired girl introduced herself and pointed to her friend, who was waving over her shoulder. She leaned over, approached the guy, repeated his name as if not believing it, looked at him very carefully and intently. She got so close that she jumped up and gave me a kiss on the cheek and wished me luck in today's raid. The guy screamed, grabbed his cheek and didn't understand what she was doing, but the girl just grinned, pointing her finger at the fact that it was a greeting. The boy glanced sideways at the grinning man, clenched his teeth and pressed his lips together in displeasure. Cleo was happy for him. His hand fell on his shoulder again. A smile appeared and he became embarrassed. He understood that this was youth. He mumbled and looked away when he heard that he was called again, and his name sounded so surprised. In front of him stood a man in a strict black suit, his hair tucked back, his eyes narrowed, and he had a sword behind his back. The young man looked at him in surprise and asked who he was and what was required of him. He just smiled, narrowing his eyes. He is the leader of this raid, and welcomed the new participant in this event. Jean was confused again, scratched his head, flatteringly remarked that it was very nice, and they exchanged friendly smiles. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked what kind of relationship they had with Paul, because it was unusual that he was the one who recommended him. He began to find out the story that he was a friend of his sister's relative. Toy's loud voice announced that everyone needed to gather. There would now be a briefing before entering the gate. In front of this man, everyone who took part in this raid lined up. The man put his hands on his hips and introduced himself, announcing that he was the leader of this event. He looked around at everyone present and said that they had every opportunity in the future to move to a higher level. People stood with impenetrable faces, listening attentively, and it was clear from their expressions that this gathering was not very pleasant. Only one person folded his arms across his chest and lowered his head contentedly, a smile appearing on his lips as soon as the flattering words were heard. With his hands on his hips, Toy continued to rant about the safe dungeon, but one should be prepared for anything. Closing his eyes, he showed the assembled people his index finger and called on everyone to obey him. Jean glanced sideways at the man next to him, who hissed in displeasure, not understanding the fuss around the dungeon. He turned around and corrected him that it was better to be careful than to leave everything. To prepare, he cried out indignantly, offended by this. He had already leaned forward with his fist at the ready, but a shout stopped the guy and he looked back at him. The same big guy who would soon take a higher rank grinned and stopped his sidekick. Coming closer to them, he began to speak about the veterans, sarcasm and humor shining through in every phrase. Toy attracted the attention of the guys to himself, announcing that the briefing was over and that the dungeon was now waiting for them. The man turned to them, smiling, touched the blue surface of the gate with his hand, and invited them to come in. The whole team emerged from the portal. Theo was the last one out. They looked around and stopped slowly. The girls said discontentedly, they found themselves in the desert, indignantly said that they could have taken sunscreen, but the big guy wanted to finish his business here quickly and drink a cool beer. Jean began to pull off his jacket, exhaled, and was also pleasantly surprised that it turned out to be a desert. The leader spoke up and announced that if everyone had left, it was time to move towards their goal. The young man noticed that the other people were taking this mission too lightly. They were discussing the next thing. After that, they wanted to eat. Tying my jacket around my waist, I realized that there was no tension here. Looking around at all the people, memories reminded him of the moment when Paul exhaled, and beads of sweat rolled down his face. He thought it would be easy because the entrance gate was small, but it turned out to be quite difficult. To this, Elder Jean then remarked to him that one should never lose one's vigilance when entering a dungeon. He sat on a huge bear, which stuck out its blue tongue, and the broken horns of this bear were lying nearby, and reminded that it was necessary to always remember his words. Now his face darkened and he frowned. The memories were so fresh that he suspected something was wrong. Previously, they judged the dungeon by the size of the gate, so everyone was on edge. Moving into it now, looking at the calm atmosphere in the team, he was surprised. He doubted that this was possible, that there would be no tension, so he turned to the leader with a question. Extending his hand, he asked what level this dungeon was. Theo asked a counter-question, explaining that this dungeon was literally something that only hunters of a certain rank could handle. He spread his hands, and a smile appeared on his face. He said that in case of unforeseen circumstances, the hunter does not seem to act as a leader, so there is no need to worry. Jean put his hands on his chest and chuckled, saying that it was a pretty effective scheme. So he was tormented by doubts. He was haunted by the thought that the dungeon might be higher than expected. The leader became dejected and began to stutter and make excuses. But he was interrupted by the brute, who put his hands on his hips and impatiently called the guy over to him. He frowned and assumed that if it was so scary he could leave right now through the gate, no one would reproach him. A smile appeared on his lips. The sing-alongs also intervened, laughed, and asked not to scare the poor newcomer with such a thing. He continued the story again, making a calm face. He had already said several times, There was no need to worry. Nothing would happen to them here. The difficulty had already been determined with the help of a measuring device. After thinking for a moment, the young man decided that the people were speaking very confidently, while Theo noticed that the device for measuring the difficulty of the dungeon had been used for more than 5 years, and there has never been a single recorded case of incorrect assessment, so there is no need to worry. He smiled again and narrowed his eyes. Jean chuckled, not particularly trusting the information he received from the leader, and put his hand on his chest. The same man exhaled contentedly. He said that newcomers are a pain in the ass, he cursed. The guys looked at him. The guy couldn't help but say that for a man with such a build he whines too much. The big guy tensed up and looked at him with displeasure. He grabbed him by the shirt and shook him off a little. His teeth creaked, and he asked again angrily. The guy calmly remarked that he would advise him not to make noise in the dungeon. The man laughed too loudly, and mockingly asked that nothing would happen, and did not notice at all that danger was approaching them. Continuing to hold the boy by the chest, he frowned and asked about fear. A huge purple snake had been sneaking up on a group of people all this time, opened its mouth and stuck out its tongue. Its mouth was framed by sharp horns. The men were confused and lost. They screamed and stared at her, while she brought her face closer in a green glow. The man threw his head back and opened his mouth in surprise. He fell into a stupor and could not even make a sound. The muzzle flew at the guy, hissing. He flew towards his target for an attack a little, and then the most terrible thing would happen. A sharp swing, and Jean darted towards the snake like a shadow, cut it with lightning speed in one blow and crouched down, having done the job. The snake's head fell to the ground with a sound. Silence reigned around. Everyone looked at the monster. The arrogant man gritted his teeth, didn't understand what had happened, and didn't even manage to see it. Jean scolded the guy, discouraging him with words of reminder about safety and noise. He looked at it with condemnation and concluded that in such places, first of all, a noisy person, like the bull standing in front of him, is very attractive. Out of impotent rage, he clenched his fists and watched the guy leave. The appearance of a red-haired girl with a question to the leader about this creature that is in this dungeon should not. I looked at the face that was lying on the ground. This creature definitely didn't look like it would easily complete a mission. She sat down and extended her hand to the muzzle. Toy watched closely, mentally reasoning that there should be monsters here slightly larger than a dog. The monster must definitely be in a higher-ranking dungeon. Its entire appearance was frightening. The dark-haired girl lowered her head and exhaled with hidden fear, not knowing what they would do next. Spreading her arms out to the sides, she suggested asking adults for help, but the boy leaning his back on the stone did not allow it. The boy looked down, as if he was remembering something, and began to scold the standing girl about adults. The argument was gaining momentum, but a hissing sound from the side distracted them from this activity, forcing them to look in horror at the entrance to the cave. In the gap of light, a snake's head flashed, opening its mouth and sticking out its forked tongue. The young people stared at her in fear, their eyes wide open and horror splashing in them. The crowd of people followed the leader through the large rocks, looking around, and all were immersed in their own thoughts. Theo walked ahead, narrowing his eyes and clenching his fists hard. Jean followed him and rubbed the back of his head. The leader of the group was thinking. A drop of sweat was running down his cheek. His eyes were narrowed and his frowning forehead formed a wrinkle. He was so deeply immersed in his thoughts. The wrinkle appeared even more strongly, deepened. He squeezed his eyes tightly. He had anxious doubts about this dungeon, which he could not cope with. The monster was of the highest rank. He turned his head, waved, looked at the guy. Jean immediately suspected that something was wrong. The young man couldn't stand it and finally screamed. He understood that something was wrong, but the thoughts in the leader's head were spinning. He wondered if this boy could defeat a monster of a different rank so easily. He turned away from him again, his eyes clenched, his teeth clenched, his lips forming a narrow line, the thought process visible on his face. Therefore, he did not pay attention to those around him. He was immersed in his thoughts. His neck was tense. His vein was pulsating. He tried to understand the situation, but he remembered that there had never been a case before where the assessment of complexity was mistakenly blamed everything on his imagination. The same young man who was unhappy that the hike was taking too long, all wet from the heat, clenched his teeth and exhaled, staring ahead with displeasure. He couldn't stand it, raised his hand and clenched it into a fist, turning to the leader and saying that they had been walking for about 30 minutes, and how quickly they would reach their destination. He turned to them. Since everyone was tired, he suggested taking a short break. The girl was rubbing her lower back. It was too hot and her legs hurt. Everyone was tired. Jean put his hands on his chest, exhaled, clicked his tongue, and looked at Theo with displeasure. Thoughts were running through his head that the youth had no courage at all and could not go any further even after 30 minutes. The bull chuckled. It seemed he heard the guy's reasoning, but noticed that it suddenly became cloudy. He turned around and saw that behind him on the rock, there was a snake sitting with an open mouth and sharp teeth. A huge snake towered over them, also the same color as the previous monster, purple, a huge tail circling above them. The leader shouted. This monster looked bigger and stronger than before. Apparently he decided that it was the boss, so he shouted that everyone needed to get ready for battle. The snake twisted, curled, and began to move towards them. Its hissing was heard in the air. The man glanced sideways at the boy. He looked at him and thought that if this boy had dealt with the first snake, then he could deal with it now too. So he turned back to the snake, grabbed the handle of his ball and tried to pull it out, grinning. Not allowing himself to be stopped by the leader, who was shouting in a pathetic attempt to call to reason, the man rushed into the attack. Theo could only stand there and scream about the danger, his brow furrowed again. He gritted his teeth and they would knock him down. He made a show of making sure they watched closely. Not feeling fear, but because he hoped that he could cope with such a monster. A weapon already appeared in his hand, and with a cry he rushed at the snake, folded into a protective circle of the snake, and only the eyes were visible. He jumped and hit the ball, but it didn't cause any harm to the snake. It didn't even leave a wound. Jean looked at the man intently, because she knew that it was stupid to attack now when the monster was in a defensive position. And his attitude towards attacking the dungeon was completely wrong. The man shook and froze near the monster, who was as if in a cocoon. Finally he hissed, his forked tongue stuck out of his mouth. The snake's green eyes hypnotized the young man, who stood with his mouth open and beads of sweat running down his cheek. It flashed through his mind that this was the end. The snake with green, drooping eyes opened its mouth and was already flying towards the confused man. But Theo managed to grab it and pull it away just in time. The snake's snout hit the ground and splashed stones in all directions. The leader asked him how he was feeling, gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes. Theo closed his eyes and frowned. Something irreparable would happen now, and a member of his team would die. The leader turned to the snake and shouted for it to stay away, and the man fell to his knees from fatigue. He narrowed his eyes. A bead of sweat from fear rolled down his face. As the only top-class hunter, he had to destroy this monster. He pulled out his sharp sword and pushing off with his foot, he ran towards the snake, which had already stuck its head out of its cocoon. He swung the ball with a loud noise, wanting to attack the monster and cause harm. There was a cracking sound as the sword slashed across the snake's defenses, but it didn't cause any injury. His attack failed to cause any harm. He gritted his teeth. But then he heard advice that he needed to aim for the head. Theo clutched his sword, heard the boy's words, looking where the head was. And the snake was already flying towards the man, still looking for his head with its eyes. It had made up its mind. Jumping up, he swung his sword and seemed to freeze right in front of the monster. He hung in the air, swung his ball over his head, and rushed to attack the snake. He shouted loudly that he should die already, closed his eyes, and his mouth was distorted in anger. The guy fell down and the monster's head flew off the body, and for a long time the headless neck searched for its end in the air. The man landed neatly on the ground, without looking back at the fallen head behind him, and exhaled noisily. People were happy that they were with him. They shouted that everything worked out. They breathed out with relief all the tension that remained with them. Only Jean approached Theo and asked how he was, and he sighed tiredly. He admitted that it was dangerous. The guy thanked him for saving him, smiled. They defeated the boss easier than he thought. The girl approached him and clarified that the dungeon was now cleared. Theo exhaled, but there were still doubts. She asked again why nothing had changed, and the men looked at her, puzzled. It seemed strange that when a dungeon was cleared, a notification would appear. He squinted his eyes and the wrinkle would appear on his forehead again. He didn't believe it, but the snakes continued to pursue them, and now 2 snakes appeared on the rocks and their hissing tormented the people. Theo was upset that the monster he, a top-class hunter, had barely defeated was not a boss, chuckled and gripped his weapon tighter. Jean put his hand on his hip and said, which was a shock to everyone, that this was not an easy dungeon. He shouted, opening his mouth and looking straight at the guy, again saying what everyone should hear and understand. He didn't believe it. The association couldn't possibly have made a mistake in assessing the difficulty, but he had no choice, and he stood up, defending his group of people. The elderly man cried out that these snakes were chasing them. It was clear to everyone present. You can't argue with that. Theo turned away, clenched his teeth and closed his eyes. He couldn't believe that this dungeon had a different rank. He turned to his group. They had no choice. It was time to retreat. The leader made the decision. Theo broke out in a sweat. They need to get out of here quickly and ask for support. They need to be careful. A lot depends on his decision. Jean looked at the leader. He could be praised. He quickly assessed and accepted the situation. A soft smile touched his lips. The young man looked at him without taking his eyes off him, and he liked Theo. He was quite a capable guy. And again they set out on their journey. Again they walked one after another through this desert. George couldn't stand it anymore. He cried out, turning to the leader. He blamed him for escaping from such a level. He believed that a hunter of the highest rank was not worthy of running away. He turned around and tried to explain, spreading his arms, that the monster in this dungeon was not just of average rank, they were of a higher level. The guy was confused and asked again. Speaking with pressure, the man was indignant. He did not understand how the association did not appreciate this dungeon. Otherwise, how could a newbie defeat a monster? He was still scratching his understanding that Jean had dealt with the first monster. Our hero corrected him so that he wouldn't make noise, otherwise he would attract monsters. This made the guy even more excited. He's not afraid of them, he was just not careful before. The guy sprayed himself even more, and didn't notice that the rustling sound came from a depression in the stone. George ran away from the cave but kept looking at it, clenching his hands into fists, gritting his teeth. The leader also looked in that direction. Instead of a monster, they heard a plaintive squeak, and the girl asked for help, peeking out from behind a rock. A girl with purple hair and tears in her eyes asked for help, holding onto his shoulder. Claire ran up to her and was about to touch the girl, whispering soothing words to her. The child fell into Claire's arms and whispered with the last of her strength that her friend needed help. She raised her head and began to tell him that they were attacked by a monster that appeared out of nowhere, and that her friend was seriously injured when he tried to save her. Theo closed his eyes. The thought process in his head was going very hard. He didn't understand how a child could end up in this cave. He leaned forward, asking the girl how they ended up here, because they didn't look like a hunter. The girl with purple hair looked away, and admitted that one guy said that there was a part-time job in the dungeon where she could earn a lot of money from her. All she had to do was hide quietly. Then George stepped forward. He understood what was being discussed and what the girl was saying. Everyone looked at him. He shouted loudly, pointed his finger at the girl. I heard that there was a legend about the robbers. Jean asked again, not understanding what that meant. Then Theo tried to explain that there were people who cleaned up raids to get a reward for completing the dungeon. Still, our hero didn't like such reckless children who risked their lives in the dungeon. George also didn't like that such strong monsters appeared in the dungeon. He thought that it was all because of the brats. They made the dungeon unstable. The leader assured that the appearance of strong monsters does not concern these children at all. But one could not be absolutely sure of this. He stood his ground. The elderly man interrupted the argument, turned to the leader and asked what to do with the children. Now the goal is to save them. Showing too much emotion, George was outraged that they had to be saved in such a situation, and did not want to go and save them. The leader closed his eyes. He understood that this situation would be very difficult, but they had no choice. Jean intervened in the conversation and volunteered to save the children. Theo couldn't let this happen. It was too dangerous. He turned his head in different directions. Pointing his finger back at himself, he added that he couldn't just leave like that, and asked if he could go alone. George grinned. He won't stop someone who decided to risk his life. He gave in to Theo. The character said that he would go to save the children, and he should take care of the rest of the group. He realized that in front of him was not quite a simple hunter, who initially seemed not quite a mature hunter. The leader of the group made the right decision. He agreed with the guy and relied on him. Coming closer to the girls, the young man announced that he would carry the child, which surprised Claire. The girl with purple eyes leaned forward, also looking at the guy in surprise. She barely audibly asked about her friend and whether he would definitely save him. The answer was important to her. Jean smiled at her with a dazzling smile, such that even his face lit up, and answered confidently that it was true. The leader gave the order for them to continue moving. George scratched his head thoughtfully. Approaching their backing singers, the men whispered to each other, certain that the boy was definitely heading towards certain death. Claire had already approached her friend, but was looking thoughtfully at Jean, who was already lifting the little girl into his arms. She noticed, without taking her eyes off him, that everything should be fine with him. She did not understand the reason, but she was worried about him. The group leader left with a heavy heart. He had no choice, he hoped. He hugged himself with his arms, exhaled. He was very scared, you cursed, clenching your fists in impotent anger, boy. He remembered well that adult with a gold tooth, who smiled widely and promised that it would be a complete freebie, who persuaded him to go. And while he was telling and flattering that this dungeon was not too difficult, the boy, although he doubted, was already ready for anything. And hugging her by the shoulders, the man continued to assure that nothing terrible would happen. Even if they caught her, she would simply receive a warning, so there was no need to worry. The inserted gold tooth sparkled. The eyes remained cold, but he continued to tempt the boy with the idea of imminent wealth. Now, hugging himself, he cursed and swore at that man and worried about his little sister. A rustling sound from the entrance made the boy tense up. He tightly clutched the stick lying nearby and prepared for what would happen next. The appearance of my sister caused surprise. I didn't quite understand. I examined her. The girl was running ahead, and behind her, holding onto her waist, walked Jean, who saw the boy and realized that he was the girl's brother. Pointing at the man, the girl noticed that he was a hunter who had come to help them. Hans doubted him because the hunter in front of him was too young, pointed his finger and asked again, uncertainly. Our hero walked forward and flicked the guy, demanding that he think about his words. The boy started screaming. Tears gushed from his eyes. He grabbed his hair, did not understand who was standing in front of him, and Jean was outraged that the boy was talking rudely to him. He concluded that if he was a student, he should be at home doing his homework. The girl intervened, looking down, and began to talk about how they had nowhere to go. They had run away from home. They had no money, so they had no choice. Our hero stopped, upset that these children had been deceived and had been led into a dangerous place, and saw how the sister leaned towards her brother. It's time for them to go to the others, Jean noted cheerfully, assessing the situation. Before they had time to leave, a huge snake with spikes on its neck and horns hissed, wriggling nearby. The guy stood up. He thought they had escaped. He swore. But it turned out that this was not the case. He returned to his place. He twisted his leg. He should be left. The girl started screaming. She couldn't leave him again. The character said with a smile that they would not leave him, and the surprised children stared at the hunter's back. The boy couldn't stand it and shouted for him to grab his sister and run away. There's no point in fighting here. He was too relaxed, so without turning around, he said that he shouldn't be so arrogant, forcing the boy to open his mouth. Children should be under the protection of adults, he said decisively, and rushed into the attack. She moved between the rocks. Theo walked ahead. The others followed him through the desert. George walked with displeasure, clenched his hands, cursed. He didn't like that they were in the dungeon and running away instead of fighting. Theo turned around and said that they should be patient for a little while. They were almost there. He thoughtfully lowered his head, his thoughts hovering in worry about the children, and the fact that Hunter Jean must be fighting alone. He lowered his head even lower and closed his eyes. He was overcome by doubts about how he was doing, whether he had made the right decision. An elderly man, leaning on a rock, noticed ahead that there was a gate somewhere here. His mouth dropped open at what he saw. He was surprised and shook his head, as if he couldn't believe what he saw. He turned to his leader, calling him over to him. He also raised his head in surprise. The man shouted very loudly that the gate was disappearing, and that he needed to hurry. The clouds were gathering. Theo screamed with his mouth open. He was stunned by such a phenomenon. George, who also came closer, opened his mouth in amazement. Then he turned to the leader and clenched his fists and shouted that they had been following him all day, so what should they do now? Theo's face darkened. The gate to this dungeon appeared about 3 days ago. If it closes, the harbinger of this is that the dungeon will begin to grow. People were huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next. The man was lost in his thoughts. Suddenly he remembered those children, and assumed that the dungeon began to grow because the children entered earlier. The leader understood that all the people were worried about him. A man came up and shyly scratched his head, but decided to clarify what they would do next. Theo threw up his hands and noted that the gates would open again once they had cleared out the dungeon. George cried out indignantly. They won't be able to cope with monsters of this level because they are weak hunters. Then the man turned to him and said, if they don't clean it up, then the gate won't open and they'll be stuck here forever. If a rampage starts, the gates will be forced open. It will be a little dangerous, but they can use this chance to escape. People gathered in a group again, exhaled. They had no other option. They needed to calm down and assess the situation. He chuckled with displeasure and looked at the leader, frowning so that a wrinkle formed. They were surrounded by monsters. They hissed and moved towards them, making a terrible sound. The people recoiled in horror. They were surrounded by monsters, and were confused for just a moment. The monsters were heading towards them, flashing green. Theo grabbed his weapon and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. The leader calmly reasoned that there were only 5 of them, and if they calmly took advantage of their weaknesses, even low-ranking hunters would be able to destroy them. You have to follow his orders. He pulled out his sword at the ready. Now he will lead them. George ducked, cursed in his hand, his weapon raised, ready to attack. Theo clenched his fists and rushed forward, shouting in a commanding tone that they needed to follow him. The wind swung the ball and jumped on the first monster, who had already exposed his mouth. The sword flashed and tried to cut the snake in half. He clenched his teeth. Another monster hissed nearby. The snake threw the man away. He was able to group himself and cover himself. The blows delivered were useless. They did not cause any harm to the monster. Heard a girl's scream from the side. We'll help cope. We'll provide assistance. The fire spread. The man jumped, and they all attacked the monster together. The one who helped was a girl with purple hair and glasses. She grabbed the staff. Theo saw that the monster had turned its attention to the woman, and cried out that his opponent was him, and not someone else. He swung his sword and cut off the head from the body. Blood spurted out. The body still hung in the air. The leader landed on the ground. His head fell off. But the two that were on his body hissed again. The people stopped. They were surrounded by monsters. There were still 3 snakes left. It was difficult, but they should cope. George said out loud that these creatures are not so scary and can be dealt with easily. A monster with 3 heads rose up behind the young people, hissed and flashed its green eyes, ready to attack. The man recoiled. He saw that the monsters were approaching them. He exhaled, wondering how this was possible. Theo closed his eyes. His face darkened. The reason for the appearance of these creatures remained a mystery. Apparently the dungeon went mad. The snake wagged its tail and people scattered to the sides. George's friend fell to his knees and found himself dangerously close to the monster, screaming and asking his brother to save him. The guy ran away as fast as he could, looking at the man asking for help, but he didn't linger. His own life was more important. The boy was all sweaty. He looked at his friend in shock and his voice was already becoming quieter. He hiccuped in fear when he noticed that a face with sharp teeth was next to him. A stone hit the snake's face from the side, thereby distracting it from the man. But now the monster's object was another person. It was Claire, her legs shaking and unresponsive. The creature turned its fanged face. Clutching a bow in her hands, the girl came to the rescue, but she herself was afraid of the monster. She shouted, giving the order to the leader, who flew into the air and struck, cutting the head off the body. The sharp blade flashed and hit the target straight on, squeezing the handle of the weapon with both hands. He cut one head, returned to his place, went down, thought that it was easier now. Good. But it turned out that the guy had miscalculated. The head was not the monster's weak point, and quickly recovered. He narrowed his eyes and looked intently, hoping to cope and not let his group down. The snake growled, leaned forward, and the wave knocked Theo off his feet. He flew away from him. The stones flew to the sides. Drops of blood flowed out along with the leader's cough. He closed his eyes and beads of sweat rolled down his cheek. Claire screamed as she saw the leader thrown back onto the rocks and hit his back, fear flashing in the girl's eyes. She recoiled from him, backed away, still clutching her weapon in her hands. She looked in surprise at the man who appeared next to her, but didn't have time to say a word. Only by following orders did she end up in the arms of a boy, who carried her away from the monster that was already digging the ground. The heads of the huge snake hissed and twisted behind the young people. Steam was coming out. Stones were flying to the sides. The monster was angry. As soon as she saw who saved the girl, her cheeks turned pink, and she exhaled in surprise. Jean looked at the creature. A smile lit up his face. He praised Claire. Now it was his turn to intervene. The young people stopped, looked at each other, and the girl, embarrassed, wrung her hands. I asked again about the girl's health, and he said that everything was fine, with the same smile. The leader took them out of their mutual stares and asked the hunter questions about the children. He closed his eyes, asked in confusion about the children, and still sat leaning against the stone wall. The main character smiled and assured the man that the children were fine, and there was no need to worry about them. He was worried about something completely different. He looked back at the 3-headed monster. The gates were closed. The boss was here, he concluded about the riot of the dungeon. He squeezed and closed his eyes. Drops of hail rolled down his face, asked for forgiveness, considered it entirely his fault. Jean calmed him down. Their leader had already stood up, holding his weakened hand with one hand. He understood that the situation was too difficult, even for a leader of such high rank. I turned around and looked at him with a smile and praised him, because he really did try hard. And now the main character turned to the monster, assessed it, and squeezed the weapon in his hands. He looked from under his forehead, his eyes sparkled. Now it was his turn to help. He smiled a strange, slightly crazy smile. Spreading his arms out to the sides, the young man flew into an attack on the 3-headed monster with complete determination in his eyes. The boy flew up and stopped right in front of the monster, preparing to attack and cut off its head. He flew up to one of the 3 heads unnoticed, swung his sword, and was almost touching the snake's neck. He delivered a crushing blow with his sword in a jump, and the monster flew into pieces, its head separated from its body. He jumped back from the still-moving headless neck, without turning around, thinking that he had chopped up another one. The leader stood up and shouted that it was useless. This monster's head regenerated even when attacked. Jean glanced at him. He turned away, looked at the monster, who was now actively recovering. Irritation overcame him, bowed his head to Theo in apology. Claire folded her hands and prayed, closed her eyes, It was all useless. Death awaited them. The hero whistled in surprise. Theo's face darkened. He also thought that this was the end for them, and they would not be able to get out of here. Jean answered everyone with a smile. There is no need to give up. People looked at him in amazement. With his words, he shook all feelings from hatred to hope. He looked back at the girl, joked with a sparkling smile. He was having fun. Claire's face darkened, and she expressed displeasure that the current situation was not conducive to jokes. But the leader of the group, moving towards them, holding his shoulder, praised the boy and took his side. They gave up too early. They need to fight to the end, as the motto of a top-ranking hunter said. He also offered his help, but stopped the man's impulse. He saw his wound. He should take care. He clenched his fist and raised it, thanking the older man and his healing abilities. The girls looked closely at the men, resolutely pursing their lips as if gathering their strength. Clenching their hands into fists, clutching their weapons, the girls also decided to provide assistance. He looked at the volunteers with a smile. Jean liked this fighting spirit, and not what had happened before. He appeared before the monster and asked the group for only one thing: don't give up. Determined that if they kept attacking, they would eventually find the monster's weak point. He asked for one more thing to cover him, and the main character rushed to attack the monster, cheerfully encouraging the group of people. Only the head remained intact, but the monster was stronger than ever, with fire bursting out of its huge, toothy mouth. The creature attacked the boy. Somewhere the leader was screaming, and Jean saw only fire around him, which only grew larger. Breaking through another column of fire, the boy was already visible as a black dot, but he continued the attack, not giving up. Flashing blue, Jean defeated the three-headed serpent, seemingly very easy and simple to cut off the head. The old man asked the leader about this boy. His skills raised doubts. He was not a simple, low-ranking hunter. Theo couldn't find the words to respond. Jean looked back and exhaled. He couldn't neutralize the monster. Regeneration started working. He squinted, calculated the situation, looked at everything and everyone, immersed in his thoughts about victory. I looked at the parts of the monster that were seething and bubbling, recovering, and stopped for just a moment. He turned around and threw over his shoulder that he was already tired of this three-headed monster, which continued to regenerate even after its heads were blown off. Suddenly, the hero's attention was drawn to something on the rock. He chuckled and noticed a black liquid flowing down the stones. He grinned. He decided for himself, and it was worth it for him to try to go there. Jump after jump, and I found myself in the very place where something interesting seemed to me. From what he saw, his eyes widened and his mouth opened. A nervous laugh escaped. He found what he was looking for. He landed carefully on the ground, and behind him a monster fell, the very main one that was hiding between the stones and the rock. The group of people stared at the guy in amazement. Their surprise knew no bounds, but they continued to hold the weapon in their trembling hands. Suddenly, blue transparent signs appeared in front of their faces, announcing the end of the mission. Claire's mouth fell open as she read the ad, unable to speak, just exhaling. The group of people were happy. They were able to do it. They managed to get through and clear the dungeon. The leader smiled. His face brightened. He closed his eyes. Sincere joy completely engulfed him, because until the end, he himself was not sure of victory. The girls, not hiding their smiles, looked at each other, almost squealing in joy at the outcome. The gates appeared without delay. A funnel with a passage opened in front of them. Theo turned to Jean's voice and thanked him. If it weren't for him, all these people would have died here. Jean's appearance with his hand on his head caused smiles. This man was very helpful. They considered him amazing. The man was talking on the phone, swearing and not believing that a low-ranking hunter had dealt with the monster on his own. The guy stood with his hands behind his back, brought a report to the Sork Guild, and now gave the information to the head. He lowered his head to the glass of the hood, but admitted that the recording was completely true. Theo assured the chief that Hunter Jean should be accepted into the guild. The strength he demonstrated in this raid was real. In general, the hunter would have continued, if not for him. But he was interrupted by a man whose face darkened. He shouted at him and forbade him to say anything further. Paul folded his hands and leaned forward, leaning on the table, wondering if the hunter could handle it alone. But Theo was not afraid. He raised his face and noticed that it was just like that. They had not noticed such an outstanding hunter. Unclasping his hands, he pointed his finger at the sheet, pretending this time that he had not seen this report, and asked her to leave. Bowing discontentedly as he said goodbye, Theo accepted what the leader said without daring to raise his eyes. Left alone, the man clenched his fists. His neck was tense. He was deep in thought. The guildmaster touched his face, squeezing his eyes from fatigue. He allowed the gentleman who was in the next room to leave. The character came out from behind the door. He asked about the hunter. The man assured him that he had settled everything, so there was nothing to worry about. This time the guy really caused a big stir. Surely someone from the association will pay attention to this incident. The hero cursed, called the man a fool. People could get hurt. Didn't he ask him to prepare for such situations? He admitted, raising his hand to his face, that all his expectations had been exceeded. Everything written in the report was true. Now Jean has already said that there is a problem with the assessment of the dungeon. The association probably already knows about its mistake. But the fact that it is silent despite such a big problem is proof of this. Coming closer to the chair of the head continued to fold his arms on his chest. That this is not the only problem stared at him with a question. He nodded his head and looked at the guy when he started saying that there was an association behind the dungeon robbers who deceived children. He confessed, clenching his fists and stroking them. A sinister grin appeared. He raided their base and found out about it. Paul leaned forward. His face changed. A wrinkle formed on his forehead. The organization does not want to admit its problem. Their authority is directly related to their power. With his hands on his hips, Jean noticed that perhaps the man sitting opposite him was right. The boy couldn't resist. He leaned forward and asked Paul if he was just going to sit back and watch their actions. He was very worried about the answer. Paul returned to his place, exhaled, closed his eyes. He was sorry, but now they don't have enough evidence. He continued to talk about the strength and power of the organization, that it had grown and become bigger than the boy thought, that in order to resist it, he had to be more careful. The main character listened attentively. He raised his hand and reminded the guy of his own words that he shouldn't act hastily. Jean agreed with him. He thoughtfully touched his chin, rubbing it, closed his eyes, and had already laid out a plan of his actions, what they should do first, and would start by looking through the records of the latest trades in the dungeons. He raised his head when he heard Paul remark that it was impossible to do, and stared at him blankly. The man reminded the gentleman that he was now a low-ranking hunter, and folded his hands on the table. He continued to talk about how the records were only available to hunters of a higher rank. The man cried out. His eyes widened and beads of sweat ran down his cheeks. He had completely forgotten about this rule. He put his hands on his chest and noticed, darkening, that he was hiding his identity rather troublesomely and was upset. But Paul smiled, holding up the sheet of paper in his hands. He said that now was just the time. He handed the paper to the guy, and he now stared at the sheet in his hands, not understanding what it was. A crowd of people, whose faces could not be seen, simply crowded in a black mass near the entrance to the Hunters Association. The young man raised his hand to his face, and, as if through a megaphone, shouted that the participants in the promotion exam should line up in a queue, and pointed in the direction with his hand. Claire, the girl from the dungeon, was also here. She was clutching her elbow with her hand and standing in anticipation. The girl closed her eyes. She was nervous because this was her first exam for promotion. She admitted that she honestly doubted her own strength, whether she had gained enough experience for this, and she opened her eyes sharply and thought about the guy who saved them from the dungeon. Memories immediately dived into the time when she, embarrassed, thanked him for saving her, and wondered whether he would also appear here today or not. She immediately jerked herself up, threw her hands up and began to hit her head with them, thereby attracting attention to herself. Just as suddenly calming down, Claire turned her attention to the guy standing in front, who was indignant about the fact that the crowd was so big. The young man's actions outraged the girl, she said indignantly, raising her hands to her chest. Everyone is lining up. He looked around in confusion. Turning completely to face her, the man showed her the bracelet and spoke, mocking her with his red bracelet. She stared at him with wide eyes at this red bracelet. It meant a high-ranking hunter. Noticing a green bracelet on her hand, which meant a lower rank, the girl even became embarrassed and covered it with her hand. But she immediately got over her embarrassment, leaned forward towards him and told him that his rank did not give him a reason to behave like that. The man moved closer to her and whispered ingratiatingly that strength is power, showing her a red bracelet. He leaned even closer and whispered that the world they lived in was the very world in which power decided everything. Having looked Claire over from head to toe, he concluded that she was completely to his taste up close. The girl was confused by this. Even closer, the guy touched her shoulder with his hand and asked about the guy, which made her even more embarrassed. Jean's appearance was unexpected. He grabbed the man's hand and asked him to behave more restrainedly, because his behavior now looked shameful. Claire recognized him. She screamed and a bead of sweat rolled down her cheek. The guy turned his head towards the main character and remarked with displeasure, gritting his teeth. Apparently she has a boyfriend. The character clarified because he did not understand what had just happened. The girl screamed that it was not so and clenched her hands. After looking at the guy closely, he noticed that he also had a green bracelet, which meant that he was of a lower rank and should not be feared. He started to snap back, showing his bracelet, insulting the boy and bragging about his rank badge. Without holding back his emotions, Jean shouted that he could clearly see his bracelet. The guy got angry, muttered, "How dare he grab his hand without fear," and clenched his teeth. The young people stood opposite each other. The guy was squeezing his hand and was all tense, but Jean was in a relaxed state. The boy was completely confused. He didn't understand. He tried to shake off his hand, but she held him tightly. Suddenly the hand attracted attention and asked the hunter pack to stop immediately. He turned his fierce face and shouted who else wanted to measure strength with him. It was the security. They looked closely at the guy, who was already covered in beads of sweat. They grabbed the struggling man by the arms, who was screaming to be let go, but knew that he had to follow orders. If he continued to cause trouble, he would be asked to leave. For some reason he paid special attention to these two, shouted menacingly, and promised that he would remember them. Jean exhaled, following him with his eyes, and said that he was a fool. Claire also looked, pressing her hand to his chest, but she turned to the guy, thanked him again for his help. Jean laughed, and clarified that she had also come for a promotion. The girl's face brightened and she nodded her head in agreement. It is not done that often, so she decided to do it. Claire expressed her concerns and shared that the rank might still be too high for her. She glanced sideways and saw the boy's hand touch her in a supportive manner, calming her down and assuring her that everything would work out. As he got closer, he continued to say that she would succeed. She needed to believe in herself, and the main thing was not to overdo it. She became embarrassed, lowered her eyes and nervously fidgeted with her hands. She didn't understand why her heart was beating so hard, and even blamed it on the fact that she had gone crazy. She looked at the bent-over guy and didn't understand. She always liked mature men, but this young man gave off the aura of an adult. Suddenly the guy handed her something in his hand. She looked at him with interest and was even a little surprised. Jean became embarrassed, rubbed his nose, saved it, and since they met again he gave it to her, and the girl ended up with a sweet jelly made from red beans in her hands. Waving his arms, he began to talk about how if you eat something sweet you can relax a little. Jean turned over his shoulder and wished her luck on the exam, but the discouraged girl could not say anything. She stared at her hands, which contained jelly, carefully examined the candy wrapper, and didn't even know what to say after that. I exhaled sharply, thinking that someone might like this, and a bead of sweat rolled down my cheek. She brought the jelly to her mouth with both hands and began to eat, thinking that the guy was like an old man in a young man's body. Immersed in her feelings and her thoughts, she didn't notice how a girl was looking at her from the balcony, propping her cheek up with her hand. In a red dress and with purple hair, she exhaled sharply. If Jean had fought with the guy who pestered him, what a sight it would have been.